Chapter 4, The Black-Backed Gull. That left foot has to feel like it's in the water. In it, Mr. Switek, not in front of it. You want to give the impression of depth. I know the stupid foot is in the stupid water, I said. So how does Audubon help you to know it? He changes the color of the foot. How else? The lines aren't as sharp. Exactly. The whole form of the foot starts to blur. The texture fades away. You can't even see the webbing between these two toes. So how do I? Take your pencil and we'll lighten the strokes here and bend them just a bit since light is bent when it enters the water. Now, follow my hand. You think this is easy? I'm not lying, it isn't. I'd been working on the large-billed puffins all September, and most of the time I was working on the stupid fading foot, because an artist doesn't draw two-dimensionally, in case you didn't know. An artist draws three-dimensionally on a two-dimensional surface, which Mr. Powell pointed out to me and which I pointed out to Lil Spicer. How do you do that? She asked. You have to be an artist to know, I said. And if you think she said, then how do you know, or something snotty like that, she didn't. Figure out why. Things at Washington Irving Junior High School were going mostly okay. Mostly. Nothing had happened to geography, the story of the world, which was good because Mr. Barber checked on my book every time he passed down the aisle, drinking his huge cup of coffee. I think he didn't care that I wasn't turning in my answers to the review questions at the end of the chapters because that meant I wasn't messing up his new geography book. Mr. McElroy had been showing us film strips about the barbarian hordes of Russia with records that gave little pings to let him know when he was supposed to advance the strip. You can't believe how many film strips there are about the barbarian hordes of Russia. Miss Cowper still hadn't made us start stupid Jane Eyre, so we had all 160 pages to look forward to. Not that it mattered, because I wasn't going to read it. Mrs. Byrne hadn't called on me yet when I raised my hand, but she had called on me when I didn't raise my hand so that she could trip me up and show everyone what a chump I was. But I figured that's what she was up to, and so when she asked if I knew what a quadratic equation was, when she thought that no one in the room knew except for her, I knew. I hadn't pulled any funny business in Coach Reed's PE class. No sirree, Buster. Except that I sneaked over to the shirts team from the skins team when we finally played basketball after 2 weeks of dribbling and shooting drills. And in Mr. Ferris's class, Lil and I had done our first lab report together on creating a supersaturated solution, which meant that I did all the smelly chemical-y stuff, and Lil took down the notes and wrote it up. Oh, and I don't mean to brag or anything, but that lab report that Lil and I turned in for that supersaturated solution, let's just say that Mr. Ferris started clearance rocking when he saw it. But I still couldn't get that left foot of the large-billed puffin right. It always looked like it was in front of the water. I worked on it all weekend when my brother wasn't around, which was most of the time, and when my father wasn't around, which was all of the time. I even showed it to my mother, but you can't trust mothers to tell you the truth about stuff like this. They just tell you how good it is and what an artist you are and how they don't know where you got that talent since no one else in the family can draw. But I still couldn't get the foot right. On Sunday night, after my mother and I ate 4 thawed hamburgers and 1 large bowl of Italian macaroni salad, I decided to try for some inspiration, which is something that every artist needs. So I went downstairs to the basement and got Joe Pepitone's jacket and put it on. Then I went back upstairs to my room and rolled out the paper and tried to fade that foot into the water, because an artist has to know how to give an impression of depth, you might remember. And I started to get it, I really did. And then my brother came home, and upstairs, and into our room. And first he said, "How come you're wearing a jacket when?" And then he saw the drawing of the large-billed puffins. And then he laughed because he wouldn't know a decent drawing if it walked up to him and punched him in the face. So he grabbed it like the jerk he is, looked at it and laughed again and said, Can't you even draw a foot right? It looks like it's underwater, Duggo." And then he tore it up and said, "I guess you'll just have to try again." And then he scattered all the pieces on my bed, because that's what twisted criminal minds do. Then, still laughing, he left, not even noticing that I had Joe Pepitone's jacket on. The chump, which, of course, I was glad about, since it was a pretty close call. I went back down to the basement and hung it up beneath the stairs again. And you know what? I was smiling. I was smiling like all get out. If you were paying attention back there, you'd know why. So, on this first Saturday of October, after a week when Mr. McElroy had had enough of the Russian hordes and had probably run out of pinging film strips anyway, and so we were now headed across the Great Wall into China, and a week when Mrs. Byrne finally did call on me when I had my hand up, and when I answered right, not to brag, that it was negative X and not negative Y, and a week when I had snuck over to the shirts team again, and Coach Reed couldn't figure out why his platoon system wasn't working, and how someone was pulling some funny business on him. I went over to the Marysville Free Public Library after my deliveries, ready to tell Mr. Powell that I had figured out how to give the impression of depth. Mrs. Miriam, with her loopy glasses, looked up when I came in. "He's in a meeting," she said. "Is he done soon?" I said. "He's in a meeting, that's all I know. It's not like I've memorized his schedule. I'm just supposed to do all this cataloging by myself, I suppose." I went up to see the large-billed puffins. Maybe I ought to give them names, since it felt like we'd gotten to know each other. But they were gone, just like the Arctic tern. This time, the page was turned to a dying bird. And I mean really dying. Most of the picture was this one wing held straight up. All its feathers were spread out, and you could see how Audubon got their pattern down. 3 rows of long, overlapping, dark feathers, tipped white at the ends. You could feel how the wind would cruise over them. It was so beautiful, and it's what you looked at first, and then you looked down at the second wing, which was crushed. And then you looked at the belly of the bird, which was sprouting thick red blood all over the dark feathers. And then you looked beneath the bird, where the blood was in a puddle. And then you looked at the bird's head. After all, that's all you looked at. I would have given Joe Pepitone's jacket to save this bird. His beak was wide open, and his tongue was stretched out into a point. He was screeching while his blood ran. His head was pulled far back, like he was taking one last look at the sky that he would never fly in again. And his round eye told you he knew that everything was ruined forever. It was a horrible picture, and I couldn't stop looking at it. I was still looking at it when Mr. Powell puffed up the stairs after his meeting. He came over to the bird and took off his glasses to rub his eyes. Just so you know, he didn't have his glasses on a loop because I had finally told him how dumb that looks. "Mr. Powell," I said, "he's dying," as if anyone needed to point that out. He nodded and put his glasses back on. "That's how Audubon got his specimens," he said. "For some reason he wanted to show the black-backed gull after he had shot it." He leaned against the case. "What happened to the puffins?" I said. "I want you to work on this gull now," he said. "You see how Audubon has combined some of what we've worked on before? When he stretches out this wing, the bird seems so still, like the large-billed puffins. But the bottom half of its body is in movement, like the Arctic tern." "Not like the tern," I said. "No, not exactly." "So what happened to the Arctic tern, and to the puffins? Do you see how he's left the space white and blank behind the gull? He doesn't want anything to distract the eye from the outstretched wing. He doesn't even want to give the impression of depth." "No," said Mr. Powell. "Which we'd be able to see if we compared the puffins to the gull." Mr. Powell nodded. "So can we do that?" Mr. Powell took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes again. "We can't do that," he said. Why not? Because the large-billed puffins are gone. The pages sold. Sold? The puffins are gone, Mr. Switek, and the Arctic tern, to an anonymous collector from overseas, I'm told. And the red-throated diver sold because the buyer thought it would make such a nice picture over the fireplace in her parlor. And the brown pelican. And if you were in a meeting with me downstairs, you would have seen Mr. Ballard's secretary hand over a check for $2,400 made out to the town council of Marysville. She'll stop by tonight to pick up the yellow shank. You can't sell the pages of a whole book one by one. That's exactly the problem. When it's an Audubon, you can. Most buyers can't afford a whole book, but they can buy one plate at a time, if they find someone low enough to cut them out of a folio. I looked back at the dying gull, at its ruined wing, in the ruined book. Is it Miss Miriam who? She doesn't have anything to do with it, and even though she doesn't show it, she's distraught. The 3 trustees of the library happen to be on the town council. Sometimes the town needs money, sometimes even for good things. They'd like to sell the whole set of books, but the other 3 volumes belong to the Marysville Historical Society, and they're preserving them as they should be. Mr. Powell tapped the glass. This is volume 3, and since Marysville Public Library is not so scrupulous as its Historical Society, this is the only volume that is missing any of its pages. They're chumps for selling them, I said. There are only a few perfect sets in the entire world, Mr. Powell said quietly. And this isn't one of them. Mr. Powell nodded. Not anymore. So let's find some paper and begin on this wing. I looked back at the eye of the dying gull. Who knew that everything was ruined forever? Because that's how it always is. On Monday, Coach Reed caught me sneaking over to the shirts team and finally figured out the funny business. He told me in his sergeant's voice that I had to go over to the skins team and I had better not try to mess up his platoons again. No sirree, Buster. I told him that I wanted to play on the shirts team and he should send someone else over to the skins team if they wanted to go. He said he'd send over to the skins team who he wanted to send over to the skins team, and Buster, that was me. You can probably figure out that everything else in the gym had gone pretty quiet. Not a single dribble anywhere. I said that it didn't matter who went where as long as the teams were even, and I pointed out that with me on the shirts team we had even numbers, so it didn't make much sense to send me to the skins team. Coach Reed said that he was the teacher. I said, I thought you had to be able to count to be a teacher. He said 1, 2, 3. He sure could count the 3 days of after-school detention I had now, and he wanted to know if I'd like to see him count even higher. I said, sure. He said, 4, 5. I clapped. He said, 6, 7, and before I could clap again, he grabbed my arm and dragged me out of the gym and through the halls to Principal Petey's office. Principal Petey, who had been waiting for this moment and who decided to stretch things out and make me sweat, told me to sit in this chair by the secretary, which I did in my stupid gym uniform for almost half an hour before he opened his door and told me to come in and sit down, and said that Principal Petey had been expecting something like this all along, and Principal Petey was surprised that it hadn't happened sooner, and Principal Petey was going to throw the book at me, so I learned my lesson and learned it good. And dang it, I should take this like a man and look Principal Petey in the eye. He really wanted to see me sweat. Look Principal Petey in the eye, he said, and I did, for a moment. You're not here to look at a pelican, he said. You're here to look at Principal Petey. I'm not lying. If you had been there, you wouldn't have looked him in the eye either. You would have looked past him like me. You would have looked at the wall over his desk, and you would have seen what I saw: the brown pelican. The beautiful brown pelican, the beautiful and noble brown pelican. One of the pages razored out of Audubon's book. I've got 7 days of after-school detention, and one more for not looking Principal Petey in the eye. But I couldn't help it. Could you? It wasn't the best day I'd had at Washington Irving Junior High School. Tuesday was a little better, even though that morning in English we finally started reading Jane Eyre by Miss Charlotte Bronte, which we were likely to be reading for a whole long time, since it was 160 pages long, even in the abridgment, as you might remember. For the rest of that week, Miss Cowper read it aloud to us. I know, you're probably thinking that we were dying of boredom, but what it was kind of so surprising was that it wasn't so bad. By Friday, we were at this part when Jane is at the boarding school, and this jerk who runs it, who sort of reminds me of the principal of Washington Irving Junior High School, makes Jane stand on a stool because he wants everyone to think that she's a liar, like she's been going over to the other team in PE or something absolutely horrible like that. So she's standing there, and everyone is supposed to stay away from her because the principal says that they should, and you think she's going to crumple and just give up. But you know what? She doesn't. She sort of reminded me of Lil, which I did not tell her, and which you shouldn't tell her I said either. So the story wasn't so bad. But what was bad was that Miss Cowper decided that beginning next week she would make us take turns reading it aloud. She would read for the first 5 minutes of class to give us a running start, she said, and then she would call on the next alphabetical victim to read for the next 7 minutes. Terrific. So on Monday she started with Otis Bottom, who read like he had written the thing himself. When he finished, and when he read the parts after Jane was off the stool and trying not to wish that she could get even with Mr. Brocklehurst, the jerk, I almost wanted to stand up and clap. He was that good. Except that I really wanted to throw up. He was that good. Terrific again. When the period was almost over and Miss Cowper said, "We'll have 5 more new readers tomorrow," like she was promising a gift or something, I figured I'd better talk to her because, you remember, I wasn't going to read Jane Eyre. So I waited until everyone left, even though I might be late for Mrs. Burns' class, and I knew that Principal Petey would love to see me waiting outside his office for another 30 minutes. "Miss Cowper," I said. She was putting pages away in a notebook, but she looked up at me. "I don't know if I want to read Jane Eyre out loud. Everyone takes a turn, Douglas, even if you think you don't like the book." I looked around to be sure that no one was in the room to hear what I was about to say. I like it well enough. So what's the problem? What was I supposed to say? I looked at her like a chump. "Douglas, I know that Otis Bottom is a wonderful reader. It's a gift that he has. You may have different gifts, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't try to read it aloud." "I know that," I said. "Is it reading aloud in front of others that bothers you?" "No." "Good. Then I'll look forward to a gallant attempt when your turn comes," she said. "You see how it is. Sometimes things go bad, even when other things are going bad." I headed to Mrs. Burns' class, looking at the next few pages of Jane Eyre. I think that Charlotte Bronte ought to be shot. I mean, who uses words like these? I didn't know half of them. Well, most of them. Okay, I'm a chump. So what? And what was I supposed to do? I thought of Jane Eyre standing on her stool, everyone looking at her. I thought of the dying gull. I hate this stupid town. Detention that afternoon was with Mr. Ferris, because the 8th grade teachers took turns monitoring after-school detention, which probably put them in really good moods. So I stayed in his room after school and waited for the other twisted criminal minds to come join me for 90 minutes of forced study. It didn't help that it was one of those perfect blue, cloudless days where the trees are starting to golden up and the breezes are cool like they are during a World Series. And you could imagine having a catch with Joe Pepitone or Horace Clarke or someone like that. But instead, you're sitting in the physical science room. And it turns out that you are the only twisted criminal mind, so you're all alone while Mr. Ferris works on his next lab preparation. I flipped through the pages of Jane Eyre. Hopeless. Somewhere far away, a dog barked, a happy bark. I flipped through Jane Eyre again, very hopeless. Mr. Ferris looked up from his lab preparation. So, Doug Switek, what are you in for? Mouthing off to Coach Reed. He thought about this for a minute, his hand on Clarence. Generally, he finally said, it is neither wise nor prudent to mouth off to a junior high school teacher, especially to one who has been a sergeant in the United States Army. Not even if the teacher is wrong? Consider, is it Coach Reed or you who is sitting in this somewhat dreary room that smells of vinegar on a beautiful October afternoon? I see your point, I said. However, since it is you and not Coach Reed, perhaps we can put the time to some good use, as you seem to have given up on Jane Eyre. Have you ever seen the pelican in the principal's office? I said. Are you trying to illustrate a principle of randomness, Doug Switek? No, really. Have you seen it? I have. Don't you think it belongs back in the book it came from? Mr. Ferris rocked Clarence thoughtfully. I understand it was a gift to him from the town council when he was appointed. So you do think it belongs back in the book it came from? Mr. Ferris smiled. In general, I adhere to the notion that things belong in the class to which they have been assigned, which leads us to the periodic table. No more about the pelican. He walked over to the glossy chart hanging beside the chalkboard on the front wall. The periodic table arranges elements according to their physical properties. And to what else? Their atomic number? Good. The table gives us the name of the element. Here, hydrogen. The atomic number here, 1. And the symbol here, H. I know that you know the symbol for hydrogen already, so let's see if you can learn 6 more. Look at the symbols for the inert gases. Helium, neon, argon, krypton, xenon, and radon. I looked at the chart. He might as well have been speaking ancient Egyptian. All right, he said, and he walked to the other side of the board. Look at me and tell me that symbol of the first inert gas, helium. I shook my head. He looked at me, glanced back at the chart, find neon, and tell me what the symbol is. I looked back at the chart. I shook my head again. Mr. Ferris looked at me for a long time. Then he walked back over to the chart and pointed. Ne, I said. Good. Try xenon. He said. It has an atomic number of 54. Xe, I said. Good. Now look over here at the transitional elements. He pointed to element 29. This is copper, he said. The symbol is Cu. Good. He moved his finger down one element. The symbol for this one is Ag, I said. Good. He moved his finger down again. And this one? Au, I said. He moved his finger over one. And this one? Hg. Good, he said. Doug, of Ag, Au, and Hg, which one is the symbol for silver? I didn't even have a guess. Ag, he said. And that was how Mr. Ferris figured out what no teacher had figured out before. Terrific. I think Mr. Ferris told Miss Cowper, because in English on Wednesday, we all opened up Jane Eyre, and Miss Cowper read her 5 minutes, and then she called on Glenn Thomas, who was probably surprised, but he didn't say anything and got right to it. And Miss Cowper, and you might think that I'm lying here, but I'm not. Miss Cowper didn't look at me until the end of class, just before the bell was about to ring and Jane Eyre was about to leave Lowood Institution. "Douglas," she said. I looked at her, and I had been waiting for something to happen, and I figured that this was it. "Douglas, do you think that Jane Eyre should feel guilty for not being able to save Helen Burns from dying?" "It wasn't her fault." "That's right," she said. "It wasn't her fault at all." She looked at the whole class. "There are some things in this world that we cannot fix, and they happen, and it is not our fault, though we still might have to deal with them. There are other things that happen in this world that we can fix, and that is what good teachers like me are for." A general groaning from everyone in the class, but not from me. Miss Cowper and we looked each other in the eye. Maybe, I thought, maybe everything is not ruined forever. That day I was supposed to have my last after-school detention with Mr. Ferris again, but when I came in he told me to report to Miss Cowper's room. "How come?" I said. "Because I'm a mean old crank who is likely to beat you if you don't," he said. "I think I better go to Miss Cowper's room," I said. "I think you better," he said, and started Clarence rocking. Miss Cowper was waiting for me when I got there. "Just the person I need," she said. She held up a batch of dittos. Their blue alcohol smell fluttered around them. "I've been developing a county literacy unit, and I need a student to practice on. Would you be willing?" "What do I have to do?" "You play the part of the student who is learning how to read." Are you a little suspicious here? "The student who is learning how to read?" I said. She nodded. "Miss Cowper, if this is because you think, show me what you've been working on with Mr. Ferris." I set my books down on my desk. I went up to the chalkboard. I wrote AG. "This is the symbol for silver," I said. She came up to the board and took the chalk from my hand. She wrote SILVER. "So is this," she said. "Let's get started." I bet Clarence was rockin'. I bet Clarence was rockin' every day for the rest of the week, and every day for the next week, when I stayed after school with Miss Cowper, and not for after school detention, just remember, but so we could work together on her county literacy unit. And I could play the part of the chump student who didn't even know how to read. So she took me through the letters and the sounds they made by themselves, and the sounds they made when they were working with one another. And then we opened up Jane Eyre and picked out words that pretty much looked impossible, but we figured them out because of what we were learning about letters and their sounds working together. No one ever told me this stuff. How come no one ever told me this stuff? How come? And by the way, in case you want to know, AU is the symbol for gold, which has a hard G and one vowel that's a long O. And HG is the symbol for Mercury, which has two vowels, E and U, even though Y is sometimes a vowel in words like my, fry, try, cry, because every word has to have one vowel at least. Did you know that? And the C is hard, not like in pace or scent, where the C is soft, but like in cure and cur and care. How come no one ever told me this stuff? On Saturday mornings during deliveries, I'd practice picking out new words in Jane Eyre, sounding out the ones that needed sounding out. And I'm not lying, there were plenty. A new servitude, There is something in that, I soliloquized. I mean, who talks like that? Do you know how long it takes to sound out a word like soliloquized? And even after you do, you have no idea what the stupid word means, except that it probably just means said, which is what stupid Charlotte Bronte should have said in the first place. When I delivered Mrs. Mason's groceries, she saw that I had Jane Eyre stuck under my arm. Oh, she said, that was my favorite novel in school. It was? I soliloquized. Yes, she said. Have you gotten to the part where Bertha bites her brother and almost kills him? Mrs. Mason, I said, I haven't gotten to anything half as good as that. Keep with it, you will. That morning she gave me 3 powdered sugar donuts. When Mr. Loeffler saw Jane Eyre, he said, You poor kid. Did you have to read this in school, Mr. Loeffler? He nodded. Fortunately, he said, I got appendicitis in the middle of it and almost died. Best thing that ever happened to me. I couldn't go back to school for 3 weeks. How are you feeling? It's a new servitude, I said. If I were you, I'd start thinking about pains in my gut. When Mrs. Daughtry saw Jane Eyre, she said, Do you like to read? It's complicated, I said. She thought for a minute or so, pushing back her kids like they were a tide about to flow out the door. I'm looking for a babysitter for some Saturday nights, she finally said. But you'd have to like reading since not a single one of these kiddos goes to sleep without a book. I looked at how many kiddos there were. I figured she must have had trouble finding a babysitter if she was asking me. The brother of the twisted criminal mind. I looked at the 5 kids. 3 of them had something red dripping all over their hands. I was afraid to ask what it was. Mrs. Daughtry was probably desperate. It pays very well, she said. She was definitely desperate. Now, this is the part where I should tell you something. You know how I'm making $5 plus tips every Saturday? And we both know that's good money, right? You might remember that my father knows that I'm making $5 every Saturday morning, and he thinks that's good money too. So he takes it, since I'm supposed to be helping out with the household expenses. It's about time, he says. So I'm living on the tips that I don't tell my father about, which is what you would do too. Don't lie. It's a deal, I said to Mrs. Daughtry. 7 o'clock? Yep. I'll have the books waiting for you. Terrific. Up at Mrs. Windermere's house, everything was quiet. No typing, no dinging. She came into the kitchen where she heard me putting things away. What kind of ice cream did I order? Mint chocolate chip. That's a good kind of ice cream to eat when the god has fled, she said. I guess that means no one was folding his wings beside her desk. What is that book in your back pocket? She said. Jane Eyre. Ah, she said, as if she had made a great discovery or something. Come with me. I put the mint chocolate chip ice cream into the freezer and followed Mrs. Windermere to her study. She ranged over a bunch of shelves. Then she pulled out 3 smallish, darkish books. She handed them to me. That, she said, is a first edition of Jane Eyre. I looked at her. I guess she thought this was pretty all-fired important. A first edition, she said again. All 3 volumes. Wow, I said. She sighed. Skinny delivery boy, do you have any idea how hard it is to collect a first edition like that? I looked over all the books on the shelves in her study. It looks like you're doing pretty well. But this is Jane Eyre, one of the world's great stories. Love, betrayal, jealousy, the search for the true and complete self. It's worthy of a play. She stopped and stared at me. The smile slowly came across her face and starts to fill it. And there's the god, she whispered, and she rushed to her typewriter. She rolled a page into it, and her hands started flying. You already know how. I put the first edition of Jane Eyre back on the shelf and slid all 3 books in carefully because I guess it was all fired important. I sounded out words from Jane Eyre, the paperback edition, not the first edition, all the way back into town, and I stopped at Spicer's Deli for the really cold Coke that Mr. Spicer always gave me. I would have bought a pastrami sandwich if Mrs. Windermere had given me a tip, but I wasn't getting a tip anymore because the bill was going on her tab, which you might remember, and the other tips weren't enough to cover a pastrami sandwich and leave me much for the rest of the week. And I don't want to complain or anything, but a tip would have been nice, since it was me, after all, who brought the god back to her. That afternoon, when I got to the Marysville Free Public Library, Mr. Powell and Lil Spicer were waiting for me. Mr. Powell was trying to get ahead on his cataloging so that Mrs. Merriam wouldn't fuss at him, and Lil was speeding ahead on Jane Eyre. She was almost done. Terrific. We went upstairs together to work on the black-backed gull, or Mr. Powell and I did. Lil helped by letting me know what I was doing wrong. "Isn't there too much blood there?" she said when I spread my drawing out. "It gives the drawing drama. His wing is slanted off to the side." "Point of view," I said. "And I think his neck is too far back. It's called composition." And on like that until Mr. Powell told us both to hush because he wanted to talk about Audubon's use of the white space around the wing and the contrast in spatial perception that the 2 wings gave and artist stuff like that. Lil hushed for a while, but she started again before too long. "And do you think I minded? Do you think I minded when she leaned in right next to me to point something out? Do you think I minded that she smelled like daisies would smell if they were growing in a big field under a sky clearing after a rain? Do you think I minded when she touched my hand? You remember how I told you that when things are going pretty good, it usually means that something bad is about to happen. This is true. Just ask the black-backed gull." About halfway through October, as I was thinking that I'd have to start wearing Joe Pepitone's jacket to school because there wasn't anything else I could wear with sleeves that even pretended to reach my wrists, someone broke into the Tools and More hardware store. It happened on a Sunday afternoon. The register got forced open and all the cash taken. There was a bunch of tools gone, a chainsaw, a drill set, a wrench set, and a bike too, which made the brilliant policeman of stupid Marysville come to the conclusion that it must have been a kid who broke in. So, guess whose house they came to on Sunday night? And they didn't want any of the thawed hamburgers or German potato salad my mother offered. Mr. Daughtry was one of the policemen. "Is your son home?" he asked. "He's off with his friends," my mother said. "Is your son ever home?" the other policeman asked. I think he was a little upset. "What's he doing with his friends?" said Mr. Daughtry. "Just playing," she said. She said it kind of hopefully. Mr. Daughtry looked at me. "Do you know where he's playing?" he said. "We have a few questions. We want to be certain he's all right." Sure, that's what they wanted. I shrugged. "Thanks," said the other policeman. "You've been real helpful. We'll go look for him ourselves." They did, and it probably didn't help my brother that when they saw him, he took off on his Stingray and made them chase him about 10 miles, and he made them crash 2 cop cars, and finally they had to call the state police, who ran him down when one of his tires popped because he had taken a sharp turn on one wheel, which was something only a few people knew how to do, and he was one of them. He told us all this after Mr. Daughtry brought him home and sat with us while the other policemen searched through our garage and basement, and afterward asked my brother about 15 different ways if he had been inside the Tools and More hardware store. I could tell the other policemen didn't believe him, all 15 times. It was harder to tell with Mr. Daughtry, except he said that maybe we should hold off on the Saturday night babysitting until things got cleared up. Terrific. After they left, my mother asked my brother the same question. You already heard me tell them. Tell me, she said. I didn't steal anything. Did you take anything from Mr. Spicer's deli? No, just because what Lucas did is over and done. I'm worrying about what you're doing. You don't have to worry about anything, my brother said. I am worried. You don't believe me? My mother went into the kitchen. My brother watched her leave. He just stood there, watching her back as she worked at dishes in the sink. He stood there a long time. Then he said something she didn't hear, dared me to say anything, just one little thing, and went upstairs. I did my homework at the wobbly kitchen table, mostly Mrs. Burns stuff, and copying a map of the Mississippi River from Geography, the Story of the World, which I want you to know was still as clean and perfect as the day Mr. McGraw-Hill sewed the cover on. I also drew costumes of the samurai tradition of Japan, where we'd gone with Mr. McElroy after we left China. And of course, I did a few pages of Jane Eyre, who was settling in at Mr. Rochester's house, even though he hadn't shown up yet. At least I think he hadn't shown up. I took my time. When I finally did go upstairs, all the lights were off, and my brother was in bed. The covers were drawn up over his head. You know, when someone has been crying, something gets left in the air. It's not something you can see or smell or feel or draw, but it's there. It's like the screech of the black-backed gull crying out into the empty white space around him. You can't hear it when you look at the picture, but that doesn't mean it isn't there. The trees were reddening and yellowing. You could see the color moving like a slow tide down the hills that rose on both sides of stupid Marysville. One day it was only the trees toward the top ridges, and then the next the color was coming down. First where the trees stood mostly by themselves, and then in bigger patches of red and yellow, until the green was holding out only in the cut-ins on the hills. And then when the top started to thin out, and you could see the bare rock beneath them, the red and yellow reached the bottoms of the hills, and then the trees around town colored quickly, like they didn't want to miss the parade. Except the trees around the dump. Their leaves turned brown and dropped. Terrific. My mother and I raked them across the front dirt and burned them in the street. Do you know what that smells like? The smell of fall, said my mother. Lucas used to love to play in the leaves before we burned them. He'd rake them up and jump in and scatter them all, and rake them all up again and jump in again, until he was covered in bits and pieces of leaves. Then he'd come get me and we'd burn the piles, and he'd stand there all serious and still, like he was watching something far away. She shifted some of the leaves closer to the low flames. He'll be back soon, I said. I know he will. I looked at her face. She was watching something far away too. I hope there isn't any more trouble, she said. And so you know, that's what I was thinking about in PE these days. I didn't want there to be any more trouble, mostly because my mother already had enough. So I was really trying not to get sent to visit Principal Petey again, even though it would almost have been worth it to see the brown pelican. But I was really trying. No funny business. No sirree, Buster. And things were going okay, even though Coach Reed and I didn't talk much. We were finishing up the apparatus unit, which meant messing around on leather horses and parallel bars and ropes and the high bar, which people who are skinny and wiry like yours truly can do without breaking a sweat. Not that Coach Reed would ever say anything to me about that in a million years. I could have thrown a triple somersault full layout dismount, and he wouldn't have said a thing. Pretty much, he walked around the gym and hollered at Otis Bottom or someone else that he wouldn't talk with me, and I wouldn't talk with him. And then he'd tell us to line up in platoons, and he wouldn't look at me, which was fine, no trouble. Until the day he announced that he didn't feel like spotting us for another hour, so we should line up and he'd count off 2 teams and we'd play basketball. And he divided us into shirts and skins. And I got on the skins team, and Coach Reed went into his office. And I walked over to the shirts team and asked James Russell if he'd trade, and he said, sure. And so we did. And Coach Reed must have been watching because he came back out of his office, yes sirree, Buster, and he was not a happy coach. He wondered what I thought I was doing. Sergeant's voice. I pointed out, and I think I pointed this out politely, that I thought I was about to play basketball. He told me, and I don't think he did this politely at all, that I should shut my mouth and get over to the skins team. Is this starting to sound familiar? Then James Russell said that he had switched with me. Coach Reed told James Russell that he wasn't talking to him and he should mind his own business. And then he looked back at me and wondered if we hadn't already been through all of this before. And hadn't I learned anything at all? I could have said that I'd learned a whole lot. The periodic table and Jane Eyre and even the location of the brown pelican. But I didn't say anything, which is important for you to know, so that you don't blame me for what happened. Coach Reed guessed that I hadn't learned anything at all, but he was going to give me a chance now. He told James Russell to put his shirt back on and get over to the shirts team. And when James said he was fine on the skins team, Coach Reed gave him the kind of look that said he was going to gut him if he spoke one more word. James put his shirt on and went over to the shirts team. Sorry, he whispered when he walked by me. Shut your face, Coach Reed said to him. Then Coach Reed, who is the kind of person that Joe Pepitone would probably want to pound into the dirt with his baseball bat, looked at me again. Get over to the skins team, he said. Growled, really. I shrugged. What was I supposed to do? I walked over to the skins team. You can see I was really trying. With your shirt off, Switek. You have to have your shirt off if you're on the skins team. I looked around at the 2 teams. I think we're all smart enough to remember who's on our team, I said. It's not like we're gym teachers or something. Okay, so there I wasn't really trying. I guess that was sounding like Lucas. Coach Reed said, over there now, in a kind of double sergeant's voice. Each word slow and apart and long, carrying a whole lot of atomic weight. So are you going to shoot me if I don't? I said. I think Coach Reed crossed the floor almost without touching it, and the words, who do you think you're talking to, filled the gym. He reached for my shoulder, but when he reached, I pulled back, and all he got was my PE uniform shirt. Maybe that was what he wanted anyway. And I don't know if it was him reaching or me pulling back, but whatever it was, the whole stupid gym shirt got torn right down the whole way. Everything in the gym stopped again. But this time, it wasn't because I was mouthing off to Coach Reed. It was because of what they saw. And what they saw is none of your stupid business. It got around the whole stupid school in probably a minute and a half. When I walked down the hall after PE, it was like I was in a circle of silence. Ahead of me, people would be talking and laughing their heads off, and then they'd see me and stop talking. They'd hold their mouths shut like the funniest thing in the whole stupid world had just happened, and they wanted to bust out talking about it, but they couldn't until I walked by. So they'd watch until I got past them, and then wait a couple of seconds. And then I'd hear them start up again, laughing their heads off and talking, but low enough so I couldn't hear exactly. You know what this feels like? When I got to Mr. Ferris's class, I walked in the door to this. Otis Bottom was standing over a group of guys, and he's tall, so he can look pretty threatening. And he was saying, "Shut up! Just shut up!" And Mr. Ferris was going over to calm things down. I guess when everyone saw me come in and everything went that eerie quiet. Mr. Ferris looked at me for a second and then said, "Let's all sit down and get started," except that I turned around and walked out. He came to the door and called after me, and I started running. So did he. We reached the front doors of Washington Irving Junior High School at the same time. He grabbed the bar handle so I couldn't open it. He grabbed the bar handle of the next door so I couldn't open it, and the next. I reared back and hit him in the stomach as hard as I could. I know, after school detention for life, didn't care. He grabbed my arm, so I was crying by now. So what? So what? He walked me across the school lobby, slammed through the auditorium doors, shouted to the Washington Irving Junior High School brass quintet that they had to go practice someplace else. Now, which they did in a hurry. He pushed me down into one of the auditorium chairs, sat next to me. He said, "Tell me." I tried to get up and he pushed me back down. "Tell me," he said again. So I did. How my father came home late on the night of my 12th birthday, and how he'd missed everything because he'd been with Ernie Echo, and how he sounded when my mother told him that, how he came up into my room with beer on his breath and told me we were going someplace for my birthday present, and I should get dressed right now, how I said he didn't have to, and he smacked me and said he'd better not have to tell me again, how he'd taken me past my mother, who wasn't smiling, how he got into the Berry car, and he gunned it and said, hadn't I always said I wished I could have a tattoo like Lucas did, hadn't I? I nodded because I was afraid not to. How he arrived at the mostly dark place and got out of the car, and I said I wanted to go home, but he looked at me with beer in his eyes and said I better get in there, so I did. How I lay down on this couch and my father talked with this guy, and they laughed, and my father covered my eyes with his beery hands because this was a present and he was picking out a real surprise, and this fat, sweaty guy bent over me, and I could smell and feel him close when he pulled up my shirt. How it started, and I said it hurt, and my father pushed me down with his hand over my eyes and said I'd better be still if I knew what was good for me. And so I did, even though I was crying then too. How when it was done, after a long time, I looked into the mirror and saw the scroll and the flowers at each end and the words I couldn't read, so the fat, sweaty guy read them for me. Mama's baby. And I told Mr. Ferris how they both laughed and laughed and laughed and laughed and laughed. The funniest thing in the whole stupid world. Mama's baby. How I spent days trying to wash it off and then trying to scratch it off until it bled. How I hadn't gone swimming since then. How I changed for PE in the locker room stalls. How I wished he would. Mr. Ferris didn't say anything the whole time. He sat next to me and listened. When I finished, I looked at him. He was crying. I'm not lying. He was crying. I don't think it was because of how hard I hit him. I know how the black-backed gull feels when he looks up into the sky. Maybe somehow Mr. Ferris does too.